Wanda, thank you so much for hanging out with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks
I
for having
wonder, wonder if we could start with the broadest of strokes, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Um, I'm Wanda Nanibush, Anishinaabe Kwe from Bosley First Nation. I'm Wolf Clan. I come from the Nanibush families, Meneg families, McHugh families, all of us from this, my mother and father and everybody from the same reserves. And I currently work as the curator of Indigenous art and the co-lead of the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Whole bunch of words. And I also have like an outside of that practice, an independent curatorial practice. I also make things, write things. I activate things in the community. There's a lot of stuff that I've been doing. We also, I started a international gathering of Indigenous artists, curators, and thinkers in 2018, which has been going yearly. It's in Toronto one year and then international the next, and it goes back and forth like that. I committed 7 years to it because 7 years is like an Anishinaabe kind of stage of life. So then you have to reevaluate and rethink and then see what the next iteration of life will be. So it's like in its childhood phase. And yeah, it's been really interesting because right now I'm doing one for Toronto in December, and then it's going to be in Venice in April. So I'm doing two actually back to back. It's kind of insane. And then the last one was in Sydney for the Sydney Biennial. And the day that all the artists were in the sky is when the pandemic was called, the global pandemic. So it was really fascinating. And here I am going to be having planned 3 COVID pandemic abaquads, and it's kind of insane because I just thought, oh, I wasn't even sure there'd be one, right? Until I was in it. So yeah, those are some of the things preoccupying me at the moment. Working on a retrospective of Robert Hoole, Anishinaabe artist. He's 74 now, and this is going to be his big 50-year retrospective, and it'll be at the AGO, also opening in December. So those are a few of the little things.
Fantastic, thank you. We're just coming out of a conversation with Cyrus Marcus Ware, and Chase brought up this phrase that Cyrus had shared with him about extracting institutional resources. And I'm just thinking about the projects that you've described, particularly the Robert Hoole exhibition. Thinking back, of course, to the Rebecca Belmore show that you did at the AGO, and also thinking about Tributes and Tributaries, the group exhibition looking at the history of art, the recent history of art in Toronto. And I'm wondering, to put my cards on the table as somebody who worked at the AGO and didn't always find it easy to do the kinds of projects that I wanted to do. And having such admiration and seeing such value in the projects that you've been doing. I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about how easy or not it's been, how much of a trickster you are in the AGO, in the institution? Or, has it been pretty easy for you to come in and do those projects there?
I think nothing is easy in an institution, so we make it look easy, but it's not. Actually, I'm pretty outright about it not being easy, but sometimes, I try to be nicer. But I also think like different time periods, like institutions shift depending on who's in power and what's happening. But I think I came into the AGO from the activism of I don't know more, right? So and spending 3 years like organizing that stuff in Toronto and doing stuff, you know, across Ontario and then nationally, um, I reached a point where I think it was at the power plant talk I was giving, where I noticed there was like 200 people who came to a Sunday scene when normally it's like 10 people, right? Like that come to these things. And so I was like looking out at the crowd, and it was like my activists and, you know, the people who would come to an Idle No More event. And then there's all these art people too, right? And I thought, for one, it was the moment of like, I can't say the same things I normally say, because I actually do say certain things in in the, you know, the community that I wouldn't say to an art audience, and the art audience I say things to that I wouldn't say in that other environment. And so I was stuck in this moment of like, oh crap, I have to integrate myself in this moment. Like I have to integrate like these two people that are actually quite different, you know. And so it was a moment of realizing that I wanted to speak differently in the art, that was my choice, that I wanted to speak differently in that space and start really making my underlying value system really present in my work, and like not in the work, it's always there in the work, but in the way I talk about the work. So not hiding that part anymore. And then the second thing I learned is that carrying that reputation that I had from outside inside gave me more power in a certain way. Like it gave me internal certitude. Like I knew that I had my community's backing, you know, for certain things. And so I knew that if something went wrong, I could go outside and cause a ruckus, you know what I mean? Or like something could happen, you know, there would be repercussions. There would also be, and I also realized that I came into the institution to do work, like to get some stuff done, not for my career and not for a job, but because I wanted to make space for, because all of my friends and all of the people that are part of my world don't have space in there. So I was like, oh, I can, you know, this is just another place to make another land claim. It's another place to create avenues and spaces for us to do our work, right? And for there to be energy from the community in and out. So it was just, so I think that those kinds of things, the fact that I didn't care about getting fired, that like all of those things, and I'd already been broke, right, from doing the movement for 3 years. I was so damn broke. And if my brother hadn't supported me, you know, through it, I would never like have made it through. So all of those things I think contributed to a very sovereign kind of attitude coming into the institution, which maybe maybe if I hadn't been through that, maybe I would have been not so sovereign or able to be so sovereign. Also, I think talking to people, I always try to think of it from an Anishinaabe point of view. Like we have to treat people as human beings, like doesn't matter where they come from or how much money they have or whatever. So I'm expected, and I want to treat people as human beings and try to figure out where they're coming from. So even if I really can't stand somebody, I really don't want to work with them, I will dive deep and hard as I can to find some angle, some place inside of them that humanizes them for me, so that I can find that connection line that I need to be able to do something with them. So I think that helps as well inside of an institution full of different people who are there for very different reasons than I am. And an institution that is built on a kind of violence, and an institution that also doesn't humanize people in the way it operates, right? So it's automatically a dehumanizing kind of machine. So, which I think is what you experienced a lot of. And then I think I do too. It's just, I know I'm here for a very short period of time, so I can take quite a bit of crap, as long as I can see that there's a lot happening at the same time. but I will leave because I will burn out, right? So, because you can't work in that environment with that kind of force for very long without burning out. I don't know if that even answers your question.
Oh my God, it answered it so beautifully. Thank you.
It wasn't even my question, and I feel the same way. I wrote down a few things as you were speaking, one of which was, walking into a space, making your value systems explicit and having that be such a central methodological commitment. And the reality of burnout when making that choice, like those are such linked occurrences. And I think one of the things that is exciting to Michelle and I, as we think together about this thing we've called the Feminist Art Field School, is our genuine suspicion over our terms of engagement, over feminism, over art, over the idea of school and pedagogy. And I wonder what your reaction was to the invitation to join us here in this conversation, or how you might think about some of these categories.
Well, I think that I mean, immediately I wanted to join because it's you two, and I know kind of like the complexity you bring to these questions. So I knew I wasn't going to be sitting here like lauding feminism from a certain era that we really need to leave behind. You know what I'm saying? So I knew it wasn't going to be that. And I knew I wasn't going to be brought in as like some kind of native informant or something. So I think that's my first thing to say when I get involved in things. These are questions that I have. And then I think each part of it is something that interests me. Feminism is something that I've been engaging with since I was a teenager. I think I engage with very different streams of it. So I wouldn't be who I am if I hadn't read Emma Goldman, for example. If I think back to feminists that really inspire me, she is one. And I think it's that kind of anarchist sensibility that actually I made so many connections to being Anishinaabe, and it made sense in certain kinds of ways. I wouldn't overstate that though, because people write about that and they're wrong. Like Anishinaabes are not anarchists. I can say that very clearly. But I was a mother at 20. So I took my son to university with me, and Emma Goldman strangely became like a role model for parenting him. It's like, how do you do and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else, but non-authoritarian parenting, it's like, doesn't work. But anyway, we tried it. And so we tried all these critical pedagogies in terms of raising our kid. And he's really quite brilliant, but it made it hard for him because other parents aren't raising their kids that way. So he had to have all these bathroom conversations with other kids about racism and, sexism and things like this when he was little. So anyway, and how they shouldn't behave. So chastising his teachers. Anyway, it's very hard for him growing up with all this knowledge in his brain. So yeah, I was thinking about these things, and I think Black feminism has been central because Black women were writing about things that were really pertinent to us as Indigenous women before Indigenous women's books were being published. So that's who I turned to first to make sense of what it is to be a woman in a world where white women is the only kind of sort of category, and whiteness and femininity have been kind of the category that has been the most violent to us as Indigenous women as well. And then what does culture bring to those conversations, right? And what does it add? And then what about the experience of colonization? What does that add to our understanding of what this kind of critical practice could be that we call feminism or feminisms? And then I fell in love when I found, Judith Butler, because it was like, yay, it's queer's back. Because, as somebody who's just definitely doesn't want to live in any of the categories, and naturally I never have, and I just don't. I needed some kind of discourse, because in my own, it doesn't exist in my community. Like we have like a really kind of traditional understanding that comes from colonialism, like being instituted, like sexism and, you know, homophobia and all of that is like really strong in our communities. It's slowly going in the last 10 years. And then the discourse around two-spiritedness was kind of, it has become like another word for being gay or lesbian. And so that didn't work for me either. So, and it's funny because my brother, I'm going to meander around a little, but my brother last night, we were talking about it, and we were talking about how you have to put the pronoun thing after your name now. And I've been asked to, and I'm really resistant to it. For various, you know, we were all just discussing why. There was 3 of us at a table who all are resisting, and we're like, weird, why? Because we believe in this stuff, you know what I mean? But we just don't want to put it at our emails. So it was really interesting. Anyway, so he said, like, as a human, he feels two-spirited, but that term no longer can be meaning you're like the way you're in touch with these 2 sides of yourself. So as a straight man, blah, blah, blah. So interesting. Anyway, we had all these little conversations. So yeah, so those are all the things. And yeah, and then art, I think in the age of COVID and Black Lives Matter and I don't know more and fracking and like climate change and floods and hurricanes. I mean, if you're not asking how it's relevant, then I don't think you should be here. So yeah.
I love your meandering toward the table conversation about pronouns, in part because it's an example of the on the record, off the record work that I think we all do, the kitchen table conversations that allow us to think out loud together and help each other to find those moments of like, why do I feel this way? And why am I not able to make this? Or why do I not agree? And I think one of the things that I feel really excited about as I continue to think about conversation as method is not that we have to make all of our behind the scenes conversations public. I definitely am not advocating for that, but I think there is a political pulse behind privacy, but also what does it mean to like think out loud and to support a kind of dialogue based learning and engagement around these questions. And I wonder, as we continue to meander down our keywords, what role does school play? I'm thinking back that you and I met in an academic context at first many years ago. And how do you think about school and pedagogies these days?
Well, I love school and I hate school. So it's like a love-hate thing. Thankfully, I mean, growing up, like I was somebody who everybody, because I was the only Native kid in a white school at one point, they just kept I was failing everything and they just kept kind of pushing you through, you know how that happens. And I kept thinking, like school is just not at all relevant to my world or to my life, and these people are weird, like looking around at the way they behave and talk. And it's like, even my fellow students, oh my gosh, like I have so many stories about this stuff, but we don't need to go there. But anyway, but at one point, a lovely human like passed me a book. And I realized I'd never been in a home with books before. And so it was not around me. And I wanted to figure out my own life, like trauma, like how trauma was going to affect me as an adult, and blah, blah, blah. I was about 9. And my sister was going to, it was my foster sister at the time. Our family didn't go to university, but she was going to university for psychology. And so she said, I said, can I read your psychology books? And she kind of laughed to herself, like, haha, funny. And then she said, yeah, whatever's on the shelf you can read. And so like the first book I picked up was Carl Jung, and then Freud's interpretation of dreams, and then Adler, and like all those folks, Rogers, and like all those kind of, and that's back when education, you had to read texts, like actual texts, not secondary things. So there, I think that developed a little bit of a snob inside of me that wants kids to read like the actual text and not somebody interpreting it for them. But anyway, but I learned a lot about that, and the way that I understood those texts. When I went to university and I ended up studying philosophy, my interpretation was radically different than the standard interpretations that the world had given these texts. And so I could open up other avenues for thinking through these texts that had nothing to do with the history of how they've been read before. And so for me, it's like education can open those kinds of liberatory lines of flight, and then education can really just hammer you the same old shit that they've been hammering at everybody forever, and leads us nowhere, and nowhere new and nowhere good. So I don't know. I think school can be amazing when it is actually about education and learning and experiencing, and not about standards and canons and money, jobs, all that crap.
I'm totally feeling that. Like when I was working in Victoria, at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, because I had spent a couple of years in what was then the Canadian department at the Art Gallery of Ontario, I ended up being responsible for the historical program in Victoria. And I would just like make stuff up. I was like accused of having no expertise, because often people who work in the historical fields and museums are like, sort of bona fide art historians with lots and lots of knowledge. And I would just like get in there and pull out a few works and just muck around with them. And it's so much fun. And I actually, I think that learning how to interpret art or groups of artworks is the fun in curating. And so funny that it's not the thing that's taught in curatorial studies programs, and it's certainly not the thing that is taught in art history. But that's a weird interjection from me. My question of you is actually, I want to go back to your comments about looking to the work of Black feminist writers. And I'm thinking about the fact that you're the curator of Indigenous art at the AGO, but like the artists that you work with are actually like so diverse, so heterogeneous, and you really have brought a lot of Black artists into the program, for instance. And I'm wondering, is that, is that an institutional expectation or request of you, or are
God,
you?
no, I think they'd forget about it if we didn't push it. Sorry to say.
So you're infusing, or you're complicating the institution's expectations of you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I have I love art, and so I love artists and art and the whole thing, like truly from a very naive way, inspired naiveness. So I've been introduced to so many things over my life, and there's no way in hell I can ignore them. Like once I'm in a position to put stuff on walls or to bring artists in for exhibitions or to do programming, I can't then hive off myself and say, oh, this is the only thing I do, because it's not. And a lot of these artists know each other. We don't only work in an Indigenous world, we don't only work in a Black world. So, and the art world is one space where I think it's actually more conversations are happening across borders than elsewhere, so why would we pretend like that it's not happening? But at the same time, I fought really hard to have an Indigenous art position there with teeth and with power and all of that. because if you don't name it, nothing happens. So there's that too, right? And they had to show an institutional commitment. But I also think like I made a decision, you know, like between joining with Canadian, like Indigenous and Canadian, or hiving off one on its own, which is Indigenous art, which is what most institutions are doing across the country and in the States. I made that decision so that we can rethink the country from a whole, right? Like from a whole place. So then even Canada is not white, right? Like I don't start from whiteness of Canada. Like I'd be like, you know, I'd be a really bad Anishinaabe if I did. So I think that that's also where I'm coming from with thinking about it. It's like when I looked at the collection for the Toronto Tributes and Tributaries, it was very much about seeing what was there and seeing where the gaps are, thinking about diversifying the collection. And I had the idea of bringing artists and artworks in that weren't there from the get-go of the show, right? So for me, everything is strategy. So it's like you bring it into the show and then you can start doing this and saying, oh, we need to buy this. Oh, no, we need to buy this. Because as soon as they show it, they want to own it, right? And so because it becomes associated with the AGO. And so then, you know, it's like all those stupid things that people think matter, they don't. But I'll use them, you know, the fact that it does matter to bring work in. So I think that's also part of it. And no one was doing it. Like, you know, that there's a gap in the silos. So if Canadian ends in 1990, which is like going to be bumped up to 1995 because the contemporary is always moving. So Canadian art end date is always moving. So then, and if contemporary is very focused internationally, then what happens to those artists? Like who buys them between 1990 and to now? Like who's going to buy their work and living artists? So that's why I was like, I'm just going to break all the rules and we're just going to put them through our department and put them through this space. And hopefully the whole institution will realize there's a gap and that it has happened now more and more. It's happening everywhere. So, and then there's Julie's new position as well, you know, global arts and African arts in the diaspora. It's like, it's a long title and I just forgot it. I think that is what it is, but yeah. So that'll also like create more change too. But we're in it together, so I can't leave anyone out because it's my understanding of the world.
I have a question for you about artists, but I wonder if I could ask you to clarify something that you just said before I get there, which is you just said, I think Canadian art ends around 1990, but maybe 1995. And you made a kind of date stamp about a kind of genre recognition. And for those who might be listening to our conversation who aren't as familiar, can you expand that or clarify what you mean?
Yeah, so curatorial roles and collections have, they either have a medium specificity like photography, or they have a date specificity. So like Canadian runs from, you know, beginning of Canada, when is that, 1867? To to what they consider the beginning of contemporary art, right? So that moves 5 years, every 5 years. So right now it's 1990, but it'll move to 1995 soon. It'll jump 5 years and then contemporary can jump ahead because contemporary needs to keep moving in order to be contemporary, which is different because we use contemporary in the art historical to mean 1970s pretty much and forward. So it changes all the time. And then my position is from time immemorial till now and global. So I gave myself the most widest breadth I could have. So we even have, you know, the Maori artists from New Zealand in the Canadian galleries, and nobody really wonders about it, you know, because no one really cares. You know, a visitor just wants to see and experience something amazing. They don't really care about these categories as much as we do.
Thank you for that clarification. You know, one of the things that you just said was, I love artists. And, you know, I have been following your collaborations and exhibitions with Rebecca Belmore, and was actually, I think it might have even been the last time I was in the gallery was to see that show. And I've been thinking a lot about the intimacy of curatorial practice and the necessity of long-term relationship building. And I was wondering if you might speak about perhaps your work with Belmore in particular, or your broader thoughts and feelings or methods around working with artists as a curator.
Well, I didn't know what a curator was growing up. I didn't know what a curator was even when I was doing my master's in film. So I think I started curating before this word was even part of my universe. And the way I started when I moved into working with visual artists, because I'd always worked, like more specifically in a gallery setting, but I'd always worked with new media and performance and film and video. But it's very different in a gallery. So I, thinking about maybe the fact that I never thought about what a curator is probably helps me do it my own way. I mean, I did come and do a master's, but at that point I'd already been doing the work for over a decade, like 15 years at that point. So it's not like they could change me very much at that point. But I did think it was important to have some of that canonical contemporary art and modern art stuff that I didn't have. So that's why I did it. Okay, go back to where your question is coming from. Oh yeah, intimacy. So I began curating because I had artist friends who weren't having shows or didn't like the curators they had to work with. They had really bad relationships, or they had really bad experiences. So it also came out of a desire wanting to have a good experience, or like, what would this person produce if they were with somebody who trusted them, or were with somebody who actually understood their whole being as opposed to just their work. And so that's kind of how it started. So I think that's why a lot of the people I work with, I do have really long relationships with, or even if they're short, they're deep and very personal. I also don't like treating people like they're, I don't know, like, I just like to know people like in a deeper way, you know. I get bored if I don't. So yeah, there's part of that. Intimacy, I think, is really amazing outside the institution. Intimacy inside the institution is really hard. Like, the institution at the AGO is the first time I've ever had conflict with artists working with them. Never had it before, because I'm in control and I can make happen. And this is my desire, is to make happen what the artist wants to happen. And I have no, you know, and it's conversation. It can be messy. It can be all kinds of things. We can create it together. But the institution comes in between you. You know, it breaks your intimacy. It breaks your ability to follow through on your word. It makes, you know, it makes you say no when you don't want to. So there's all kinds of things that the institution puts in place that actually impedes some of that intimacy. But thankfully, Rebecca and I have worked together for so long that we think in a similar, like, we almost have our own shorthand. And so for us, it's like really hard to break the strength that we have together. And it's actually and we're both similarly pokey, kind of don't fuck with me kind of people. So I think it's like easier for for us to swim through that and maintain it, which I think was evident in the show. So like, even my style of curating is very intuitive. It comes from dreams. It comes from all kinds of things. So, which is not how people work. You know, it's, I can go and develop a list and then do a floor plan and like blah, 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 or a chronology and stuff. So it's like, I'll dream something and then I'll go, Rebecca, I dream these things, you know, but you don't like that work with any other work. Do you think we could do it anyway? So it's like, you know, just doing this and trusting each other and like working that way. And it, you know, and the show, in my humble opinion, is very beautiful. You know, it has a kind of beauty to it, which mimics her use of beauty in her work, which is to draw people in so that they can start grappling with these really difficult subjects and to grapple with ourselves and what's you know, the way in which we perpetuate all these violences. So.
I'm going to acknowledge my role in leading you down the path of doing a kind of specific institutional critique of the AGO. So I'm trying to think of a way to ask this question, which is a question that we've been asking everybody. I want to ask it in a way that will open it up, even though we've pinned you down.
It's all right, I'm used to it.
But the question is about what is the role of the institution in social justice, in imagining a better future. And I guess the thing that I'm thinking about in relation to your work is how important it is to share the work of the artists that you are working with. And the AGO is a place that can allow a lot of people to see that work.
Mhm.
So I wonder, you know, if you can answer the question that we've been universally answering, but I also wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the communities that you interact with at the AGO, the many people that you're able to share your ideas with, the artists that you are intimate with. You get to share all of that with so many people. And what is that like?
Mm. Well, I think the first part of your question, like role of the institution, I think from my point of view, and this is where I differ from even people in my own community, there isn't one institution. So the fact that we have multiple institutions is really important. And I don't want every institution to do everything. And so it's very different. And this is where I bump up against like people who want the AGO to be everything to everybody and actually do want it to be a community art space. And I don't, because not that I don't want community arts to happen there or whatever. I just don't want it to become something that we already have elsewhere, because it has a specific role to play within the gallery system. Because I center artists, and artists are, we wouldn't have any of these institutions, we wouldn't have any jobs, we wouldn't have anything to write about, we wouldn't have, like, the whole system rests on the artist and their labor. And so if you think about it, like I was in this meeting with, because I used to be an arts funder as well, so I know that side of things. But they built this pyramid, right, of the arts ecology system. And the artist was at the top here, right, in this pyramid. And so I just took the paper and I turned it around and I was like, actually, the artist is at the bottom and this whole thing is resting on them. So think about that, right? Like when you're thinking about funding, this is like the least funded, least supported spot really in the whole system. And even museums ignore artists, you know what I mean? Like that isn't their primary purpose. So something like the AGO, I think, is a specific institution that can do a lot for artists, you know, because it has this capacity, because it has this audience, because it has this international reputation, because it has this kind of space, because it can enter certain discourses. So this is going to sound conservative in the sense that I wanted to continue to do those kinds of things for artists, because where the hell else in Canada are they going to get that? Nowhere. So maybe the NGC will give them a little something. And now the Remy is becoming that kind of institution too, which can launch careers, you know, and people think we shouldn't care about that, right? But I do, because these are people that I live with, love, and I see their labor, I see their poverty, I see their struggle. And there's no way in hell I can think that I can just walk in there and just like want to dismantle that, you know, something that is really good for, it's probably the one place, and I've made it happen for artists too, making sure that they get a lot of gigs after, they get sales after, they get more stuff, you know, it's like, that's really important to me. And I think that's part of my job. That is social justice in my mind. And it's about economics and it's about poverty, right? and Indigenous women artists are the most poor artists in the world, you know, like in this stupid system we have here. So anyway, I would say that part's very passionate about it, but it does make me bump up against people who just want me to bring everybody in and throw up group shows and like do this whole thing. So I would say that. So the other part of that is that what you can do in, say, an artist run center and what you can do in a gallery, like a university gallery, they're different things, right? So I really miss working in university galleries, because that's why I keep an independent place in there, because there you can ask really amazing, intellectual, deep questions about, you know, like the philosophy behind something, or I can deepen people's understanding what Indigenous culture is and what it means and la la la, you know, which I can't do at the AGO because it's not what it's there for, right? So I do feel like these institutions are doing different things. But the second part of what you said is that to actually say that the institution has a role in social justice is a statement that has not been made yet. So like getting the AGO to think of itself as an actor within the social justice field has been a new thing. And it's something we've been pushing for and something that it's resistant to. And something that I think is extremely important. So yeah, so that, and I think of that different than the practices that are in there. It's like the way that it identifies itself and its role that is important for it to think of itself as a social justice thing. So I'm getting them to sign on to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the TRC and a number of other kinds of things, so that it can think about itself as an actor in the world, like something, a being that acts, where their actions could actually lead to, you know, the actual growth, health of Indigenous communities, and arts and culture is part of that, right? So just it's a shift, right, of their thought. And I think that's very astute that they don't think of themselves that way. And then I guess the other part of what you said was the AGO and audience. I mean, the audience is like, it's like a double-edged sword, because it's like the bigger the audience, the harder it is to do what you want to do. But the more you can take an idea and get it out there pretty far, right? But I still, and here's another situation where maybe I'm more conservative than other people, but I believe in experience over education. So or at least its experience is education rather than information. And so I really butt up against a lot of people who work with audience, like museums are now audience centered. They're not artist centered and they're not art centered anymore. They have moved completely towards audiences, and I'm actually not a fan of that, and I get in trouble for saying that, but it's the truth. I'm like not artist, I'm not audience centered in that sense, because they have a very monolithic idea of what an audience is, what they want, what they're doing, you know, and I want to change souls, you know, like inside, like who you're afraid of, what you're afraid of, how do you see vulnerability, how do you love, how do you, you know, approach life, like inside. That's what art can do. So I don't care if they know the facts about whatever, you know, that doesn't change how they're going to behave when they're in your kitchen table. At least that's what I believe. I could be wrong. Maybe facts do change people. It's like, oh, there's the connection back to feminism, because the early feminism was about consciousness raising was the main strategy, right? And I think that I just, in my lifetime, have really seen that that doesn't work.
I love that in your summary of what art can do, you know, who you're afraid of and what you're afraid of, like the first two things that sort of popped into conversation. I think that's incredibly dynamic and provocative. And there's something there to me too about the gallery space, like the space of encountering art and moving through space, that is particularly pointed, and I think is different than encountering things on screens and theaters. And on another day in another conversation, we could think about that. But as we come to the conclusion of our conversation, I would love to know what's animating you and exciting you these days. What's next for you? How can people attach to the things that you're doing? Where can people find you if you are okay to be found?
Yeah, okay. I think like a stutter turned into a song and then turned into a word. That was pretty good, pretty good. I was to speak about what I'm about to do also comes back to something Michelle said earlier about the excitement of interpretation, and like not putting too many like borders around that kind of space. So I think that's what I've been trying to do with the McLean Center for Indigenous and Canadian Art, right? In terms of putting things together that maybe aren't necessarily like so obvious or whatever, and not worrying too much about the building an art historical narrative. So we're about to redo the McLean Center again in October. So interestingly, we've had this like, two-pronged approach where we have Indigenous only spaces and we have, the spaces with Indigenous art and Canadian artists, and we have a lot of kind of solo spaces as well. But this time it's really swinging towards the Indigenous, like even more. So there's like almost every room is going to be almost entirely Indigenous art, which I think is fascinating. We're going to try it out. It just happened by chance, sort of. But yeah, so we haven't even really sort of contemplated how that's going to go over. But I mean, the first changes that we've done, audiences love it. It's always full. Lisa Rahana's piece is always full. Like it's interesting because I think they believed it wouldn't work and people would be angry and people would be, like, where's my historical Canadian painting? Where's the salon room? We really haven't had that, so I think it's really interesting. We had some like trouble in the beginning in terms of, because it's like a pathways model, which, me and tributaries and like this way of like not leading people is like very hard for audiences. Like they want to be told what to think. They want to be told what they're learning, and they want to be led from room to room to room in a organized way. So there was a little bit of that at the beginning, but then I would just walk them through. I say, let's go to this piece here. Let's run over to this piece and let's run over that piece. What does it make it? They get so excited. And then, so a few of the older folks who were having trouble with that are now they now are very excited. And the other part of it is that permanent collections are meant to be permanent, and we keep changing it all the time. And then there's work in there that we don't even own. But that's a way to get to be able to own it. So yeah, but the Sandra Brewster is staying up. The Blur piece is staying up, but we're gonna now put it with different work. So it was with Carl Beam, Esma Mahmood, and Tim Whiten, and some other white Canadian artists. I can't believe I just said it, like, because they're on this other wall. Anyway, Florence McGillivray, like da da da. Anyway, so we're gonna redo it with a bunch of actual kind of actually queer, feminist, humorous, campy photography, and then again some really intimate kind of paintings. So I think it's, yeah, it'll again shift, right? Like it's like, what are we looking at? Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of changes coming that way. So there's gonna be, by the time Aberquad comes, which is December 2nd to December 5th, and it will be partially in person and partially online. But aberquad.ca, you'll find it. It's spelled like it said. And everyone's like, how is it said? How is it spelled? So a lot of those artists will be doing artist talks and conversations, so they'll be able to see the work and then hear from the artist directly. So it's going to be kind of exciting. And then Robert's opening is December 3rd, Friday, December 3rd. Yeah, so that's the kind of stuff that's happening. And you can reach me, I don't know, how can you reach me? Email? I have an Instagram account, but it's private because I post a lot of things that I'm not allowed to post. So I have to make it private. But you're welcome to join my Instagram. It's Nishknows, NISHKNOWS. Used to be Critical Niche, but somebody stole it from me. So I couldn't get it back after I closed all my social media accounts because I was angry at being controlled. But now I'm back from outer space. Okay, sorry. That was really long, like blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so yeah, that open interpretation is very exciting, right, Michelle?
That's right. That was a beautiful way to end. And I am trying to figure out if I can get to Toronto in early December now. It all sounds super exciting.
Yeah, please come.
Thanks for hanging out and spending time with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And have a good afternoon.
Absolutely.
Or morning, or whatever time zone we're all in.